As promised, first question.
Thank you very much. It's a note on that our sensory system has many delays. So information from the eyes gets to the AGI, then to the primary cortex, then the information goes to the motor cortex. Eventually the motor cortex is providing instructions to the hands and the legs, and then when we see, so everything is synchronized. So the whole system is a self-referencing, and inside is everything is synchronized. Although this circle takes about 500 milliseconds to make. If information comes to the leg, it might take 1 second. And everything is synchronized in a way that I'm not surprised where my hand is. I'm expecting it right at that point, in spite of the 500 millisecond delays. And that requires a very precise, 1 millisecond precise synchronization, and that type of synchronization calls for self-knowledge, somewhere hidden, and that's the origin of consciousness, in my view. At the same time, it becomes very important to have more information about what I am doing, what is in my mind, what are my plans, and it should also synchronize together with the ongoing effects. And this taken together could be the key for thinking, doing, and the consciousness problem. It's a very simple thing, but you have to consider everything, everywhere in engineering. It has to come up in evolution, because just to give an example, you cannot tickle yourself at all. This internal system is so efficient that the prediction is so efficient, the synchronization is so efficient, the self-modeling is so efficient that you cannot tickle yourself. And that could be the origin of consciousness at a very low level and all the way up to the very high level. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Opinions? Ben, you surely has got something more.
For me? No, I'm just going to request other people to hear it. Actually, I'd like to hear what Weaver has to say about the
Okay.
self and how it is learned in AI systems. And also, he's from an organization in Brussels, from the Global Brain Institute. Do you think that, as well as a human brain, can the global brain develop a self?
First, one thing, I'm not sure that self-knowledge is necessary for...
Talk louder.
I don't think that self-models of any kind are necessary for intelligent behavior. I'm not sure about it. I used to think like that, but I'm more of the lines of Thomas Metzinger. There is some kind of representation, but I'm not, it's only one way to look at things. And from another direction, I think there are many of us. In each and any of us, there are many of us. It's a multiplicity. It's not a single self there. We kind of used to think about it as a single agency because of our embodiment, but in each and any one of us, there are many selves that are operating in synergy, more or less synergy. Sometimes it's conflicting. And
in what way do you think this multiplicity of agency is important for intelligence?
I kind of, usually I say that I ate one. I ate the number one. I don't think that we gain a lot by trying to unify things and see many things as one, that by categorization and creating categories and replacing different instances with a single, more simplified representation. I'm more of a believer of what really makes us intelligence are interactions between different perspectives. And wherever there is something successful, it diversifies. It diversifies and starts to create all sorts of processes where there is integration, disintegration, conflict resolution, and all these processes are sometimes are very easy or comfortable to look as the one agency, especially because of embodiment. I think that in terms of evolution, since embodiment is essential for organismic agency, this kind of clamped together with an idea of having a self. But I'm not sure it's necessary. It's just a way of thinking about it.
So you identify a unified single self model with a unified perspective to some extent on the relation between the organism and the world. So you think having multiple self models helps an organism have multiple views of its relation with the world, which would then make its intelligence more general?
Yes, definitely. I think that this self-model that we are used to compute in our minds is just staging along the journey. It's not an endpoint. There is nothing special about it to indicate that there is a principle of intelligence or a principle of perception. It's only a stage in evolutionary process, and I wouldn't like to concentrate too much about it, or it sounds like natural. I will talk about it later on in our workshop. I try to give a few more hints about it, but thanks.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm trying to keep the order.
Yes. So answering to Ben's question on other concepts of self-model, I would say that I have written a couple of papers on cognitive engine in which this is based, the goal is based on maximizing the information gain, which is not a really new concept, but in this case it maximizes the exchange of resources on information which is especially defined. And in this model there would be, the self would emerge as a model of phenomenon, because it is more effective to create a model and test some ideas on a model which is in mind than in vivo. And eventually this would result in some action. But since this is this gain in exchange of resources to information is that on a model in mind it's better than the model is created, and self is just observation of that model, which is just on which we can test the phenomena in nature, and then so this is necessary from the point of view of information processing, where we maximize this utility function, which is exchange of resources on the information. And this is that I don't know how if it would emerge, because I have not such results, but I believe that this would be the way it could be emerged.
Thanks. Quickly twist here. Yeah, sure.
To get back to Metzinger, in my view, his contribution is mainly one to the field of philosophy of mind. You probably all are familiar with the famous Libet experiment. Libet was a neurosurgeon, and at some point he opened the patient's brain, or skull, and put electrodes on the brain, and people were conscious when he did this, and he found that the conscious point of decision making did not coincide with the necessary activations of the brain that mediated the initiation of the action. And Libet was extremely surprised by this, and many philosophers along with him. As a computer scientist, I think you would be extremely surprised why he was surprised at this, because he would think, of course, this is an extended process that needs to be computed in the brain somehow, it's going to take some time, And at some point it will be represented to the system that it has made this conscious decision, and this representation is not the cause of the decision making itself, but rather it's at the endpoint of the decision making. You're going to see all these processes lead up to this at some point in the activity of the brain. And the reason why Libet found this so confusing is because he had some probably not conscious preconception and intuition that the mind somehow remote controls the brain. And that the mind is an agent, that the self is an agent, and the self is the thing that does the decision making, the conscious decision making, and then tells the brain, now please start moving your finger. And then you should see the activity in the brain after this conscious decision has taken place. And even very late, much later, Libet tried to find ways around this by presupposing maybe the brain comes up with this action potential just in case, and the self can step in and stop it at the last possible moment. So if it really decides consciously not to move the finger and so on. As I said, as a computer scientist, this is not surprising. And the great contribution of Libet, of Metzinger, is that he told people that cannot program, that is philosophers, because otherwise why would there be philosophers if they could have hold down a real job with real pay? That actually, no, the self is not an agent. The self is not what contributes, what perpetuates these actions. You are being no one. There is a system, the mind, that operates on many, many levels, makes decisions on many, many levels, and many of those decisions are bound together in a story. And this story is what we perceive as being our model of self. And then he went on to do a conceptual decomposition of this and looked at the different components of this. As a computer scientist, I still don't think it's a specification that I can work on. And there are 3 points that I would like to remark on with respect to this. That is, first of all, what parts of this thing need to be explicitly implemented as distinct functionality, and what parts of this are emergent. So imagine you have a system that takes available features, data at its systemic boundary, and tries to find patterns in these data and organize them into concepts. And at some point you realize that there is a class of features that is sometimes there and sometimes not, and you group this together into environment, and then there's a class of feature that's always more or less present, and you group this under self. So you basically got 2 classes of modeling elements, and if you go through this wonderful list that you have presented on your scorecard, you basically find that if you take all the elements of features that are basically always there, you get to your scorecard. So aspects of planning, of emotion, of decision making, and so on, they are all going to be represented, so you can have a high-level story that enables learning and meta-learning. And if you have these features present, some of them you do not see the actual process at work. For instance, you do not get to observe your decision making itself, but you get some interesting aspects of the process. Some variables are going to be made visible to higher level protocols, and you can access these higher level protocols to learn from them over time. So you probably do not need something beyond the fact that these things are made available in your protocol and in the different meta-level representations of the mind, and some general classification and concept building and reflection mechanism, then you're going to get to all these different aspects, in my view. So it's not that clear that you would need to implement additional functionality one by one by one by one to get to this particular kind of self-model. There's something also that I think is interesting. There's this transparent versus opaque representation. You just mentioned this in the context of it's difficult to recognize that you have errors in your transparent representation, which is a minor aspect of this. The major aspect of transparent versus opaque representations in Metzinger's framework, and I think it's a very useful one, is that transparent representations are those that we perceive as being real, that we cannot abstract from, whereas opaque representations are those that we perceive as being ideas, that we know not to be true. We know that these are imaginations, and there's a fundamental difference between those. If I see a person, I do not perceive the fact that I'm looking at a representation in my mind. I am engrossed into the belief that I'm perceiving reality as it is. I perceive this as being a real thing. If I imagine a person, I know that this is an idea, and this idea might be wrong, and this person might be looking different, and I imagine it. And this is the difference between opaque and transparent in Metzinger's framework. So the question is, how can we turn a representation into reality? And I think this should be the other way around. How can we recognize that a representation is just a representation? And I think our mind needs to explicitly label it. And if that label is missing, then our mind hypnotizes itself into believing that it's in a particular kind of reality. Objectively, all our brain can do is it measures probabilities. But we do not perceive that we live in a sea of probabilities, we believe in a narrative. And I think that's because our brain hypnotizes itself into believing in some kind of narrative that it has constructed. Because it does not label the narrative as such. It does not make it visible as something that is opaque. Now that self is not the self, and this is my main critique on this, because there is a difference between modeling the fact that I do have decision making, that I do have emotions and so on, and the identification with this. Especially if you meditate or when you are in a dream or in a lucid dream, you get to see all these differences, and Metzinger is also aware of that. But it's important to realize that this nexus of consciousness that we identify with the self is not exactly the same as this model. So for instance, you might be in a state where you don't have a self, you don't have this ego and this nexus bound together, but you're still able to access your physiological parameters. So if you can go in a very deep meditation where you deconstruct yourself, and you still have access to many of those aspects. And so for me an interesting question is, what is this nexus of personality, this nexus of identity? And I think this is indeed some kind of functionality that has to be present. And it's, because we don't have much time, I won't go into detailed theory there, but I guess that it's possible that there's a general substrate in our cortex that enables the emergence of such a nexus, of such a persona. And this, that can also be multiple of those. So there seems to be indication that using detailed techniques, we can create a split persona in our cortex that we can talk to, that gets their own voice, that gets their own internal monologue, and that gets to go into a dialogue with us. So basically something like a virtual human existing in our own mind. And maybe it's even possible that when we meet other people in dreams and talk to them, that some of them are conscious, that they are basically sub-selves that are emergent in our cortex, and that get to be people sharing some basic infrastructure that makes them act like there are people in the novel that interact with us. And of course, our own self is a construct like this too. It's something like an invented persona that lives in our brain and tells itself a story about being a person.
Thanks. Sorry, I think the last question. Sorry.
So going back to the idea that the self is something that we discover through being able to move parts of our own body versus other objects external to us, or in your case, being things that are always there versus things that are not always there. With children, it actually, the first step is understanding your limbs and your own movements versus other objects. But there's another step to that, because in actuality, you may know the story of orphanage in Eastern Europe shortly after the war, where they had so many orphans. They were able to feed them, but they were not able to pay attention to any of them. And most of those orphans, despite having every need for sustenance, died. And the reason is described by a psychologist named Philippe Brochet, who works out of Emory University. He studies what he calls others in mind, and he says, we think, therefore I am, and that you can see the point at which infants start to see themselves through another's eyes. So they need the responsiveness of another entity responding to them as a self and reflecting them. So the child will start to imitate the movements of the parent without really knowing that they're imitating it. But when it really clicks is when they make the movement and then the parent mirrors it back. And then it's like, oh, I caused this in this other entity. So this is a different kind of self-discovery.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I also believe that self-model and other model are really the same. So I believe that self-model explains the other model, and there's a few slides I couldn't show anymore. So, and I think this is technically implementable, like the other model using the same technology as the self-model, and then the other way around, in order to enable practical social reasoning. But that's a different thing. There was a comment here from. Excuse me, there was a comment from the side here. I think you wanted to say something.
Yes. It was quite a time ago, and I just got lost in my thoughts already. I had a remark.
Closer. No, it's on. Just closer to you.
I had a remark that I wanted to share that just like sort of looking back in time, it was one of the first lectures on this MBL principle. So if you could rephrase what was just said in the last like 10 minutes, we could just state that in this language that the MBL for consciousness would be zero in at least some contexts. If that's like more clear to you.
Not sure. No.
Well, just consider this.
Okay, thanks. Jose, you want to say something about testing? Does this model of 11 layers plus then scoring make any sense to you?
People are hungry. I don't like the C word. I don't like the Q word, qualia. I constantly don't like the F word, free will. But I think that the self-modeling ability is measurable. It is measured in humans, in children, in animals. Of course, we could think of different tests for general intelligence of AGI. And that's what I can say. One thing is just all of this, and another thing is if you want to measure that, I think they are related, but I would like to avoid some of these words and just go to. So I think this idea of just talking about self-modeling, it starts from a philosophical point where I personally get lost very easily, even though I did my PhD in the philosophy department. But I remember in my metaphysics course, it was painful for me. And just that, I don't have anything more to say.
Thanks.
So in the vein of hounding other people into speaking, we have someone from the Santa Fe Institute here. So I'm curious if Jim can tell us something about the self from the point of view of complex self-organizing systems.
No, actually. Just to say a tad more, I have been thinking about it for some time, and maybe it does, and maybe it doesn't.
You're probably not wrong. Okay, I think we're slightly over time, but is there? Okay, over. Thank you very much. Been a pleasure. See you later.